David, we're still waiting to see if the state government in China issues some kind of a formal statement, because at this point, this is just a report that is out there.
China has responded in Donald Trump's trade war, halting orders of Boeing aircraft.
US President Donald Trump has remained firm that China must be first to step up to the negotiating table on tariffs.
Tensions between the United States and China have now reached the skies. More specifically, the aviation industry. A striking example of this is the crisis currently engulfing Boeing. The recent directive from China's Civil Aviation Authority, ordering Boeing to suspend aircraft deliveries, triggered a sharp decline in the company's stock and exposed just how deep and long-lasting this economic confrontation may be. This isn't just about one company or a single industry. This is a hit to global supply chains, millions in salaries, and billions in business transactions. So, what numbers actually reflect the scale of this crisis? Let's walk through the unraveling of US-China aviation relations and the figures that tell the story behind the headlines. By the end of last year, Boeing's global order book included around 4,500 jets. Over 1,200 of those were tied to existing or potential deals with Chinese airlines and leasing companies, making up roughly 26% to 28% of the company's total backlog. The list price for a wide-body jet typically hovers around $300 million, while narrow-body aircraft come in closer to $110 million. Although final sale prices tend to be negotiated lower, industry analysts highlight that Chinese orders form a cornerstone of Boeing's annual revenue, bringing in between $10 and $12 billion a year. When factoring in long-term maintenance agreements and replacement parts, that figure grows even more. So, if China is now pausing or canceling deliveries, especially those expected in the near to medium term, Boeing could be facing the loss of a massive portion of its yearly income. Market reactions were swift. Within days of the announcement, Boeing's stock had dropped by roughly 9% to 10%. Analysts argue that the plunge wasn't just due to the Chinese halt on aircraft purchases, but also over fears of more retaliation down the road. Investors are now worried that if this freeze persists, Airbus could steadily absorb Boeing's share of China's civil aviation market. Just looking at data from 2024, combined Chinese orders for Airbus and Boeing added up to around $14.5 billion. Should Beijing redirect more purchases to Airbus or fast-track domestic production via COMAC, Boeing might see that revenue shrink to between $5 and $6 billion per year. That kind of loss could eventually wipe out as much as $40 billion in Boeing's market value, which explains the growing sense of panic among investors. And this isn't just about Boeing, it's about the broader U.S. economy. Civil aviation exports are a key lever in narrowing America's current account deficit. According to official figures, U.S. civil aviation equipment exports generate somewhere between $130 and $140 billion per year. A large chunk of that comes from Boeing's commercial jets, along with related parts and maintenance services. China accounts for between 15% and 18% of that export market. So, losing that share would equate to a multi-billion-dollar blow to America's trade balance. What's more, Boeing's supply chain stretches across nearly every U.S. state. From engines and avionics to landing gear and passenger seating, thousands of small businesses are involved. Many of them rely on contracts tied to aircraft or components bound for China. If those deals are suddenly cut off, job losses could ripple through the country. Early forecasts suggest that suppliers of engine components alone might lay off between 5,000 and 10,000 workers by the end of 2025, something U.S. labor unions and lawmakers are already raising concerns about. On the Chinese side, however, replacing Boeing isn't as easy as flipping a switch. Beijing has made clear its intention to deepen ties with Airbus and ramp up its own jet programs like the C919 and CR929. But walking away from Boeing's wide-body aircraft in the short term would still be painful for Chinese airlines. That's because Chinese carriers heavily depend on Boeing's 777s, 787s, and the 37 MAX for long-haul international routes. Replacing those planes with Airbus models would require retraining pilots, altering maintenance setups, and revising spare part inventories, resulting in millions in additional costs and months-long transitions. It's also uncertain how soon COMAC will be able to mass-produce aircraft at scale to fill the gap. In short, China's move could cause its own short-term disruptions. But some observers believe Beijing is thinking strategically. We'll take a hit, but America will hurt more. It's a high-stakes game of economic chicken. Neither side seems willing to blink. An analysis of recent tariffs reveals the U.S. has slapped duties ranging from 25% to 50% on select industrial and tech imports from China, and has threatened to go beyond 100% on sensitive items. China, in turn, has restricted U.S. agricultural goods and energy exports, and more recently added short-range commercial aircraft to its list. The result: China is effectively shutting down all deliveries of American passenger jets. Previous Boeing contracts in China were valued at an estimated $150 to $160 billion. If that business now migrates to Airbus or other competitors, Boeing could suffer long-term financial wounds. The company has already lost between $15 and $20 billion in market cap just this past week. Boeing was already dealing with billions in losses from the 737 MAX grounding during the pandemic. Now this. Some analysts warn that if the Chinese embargo continues for 6 to 12 months, Boeing's aircraft revenue could plunge 20% to 25%. Out of Boeing's 140,000 employees, around 30,000 work on commercial plane production. A drop of just 1% in operating margin could endanger thousands of those jobs. What began as a policy of America First is now turning into a potential blowback for U.S. labor itself. Recently, President Trump pointed fingers at Beijing, claiming China backed out of the Boeing agreement and is responsible for the fallout. He also accused China of currency manipulation and applying unfair trade practices. The tone from Washington suggests no softening in its stance. Trade experts are sounding alarms. They warn that if this keeps up, U.S.-China aviation ties might suffer irreversible damage. Rumors are swirling that Airbus may unveil a new Chinese deal at a press event later this April. If they announce a 150 aircraft order, Boeing's market share in China could evaporate almost overnight. Boeing executives privately say such a move would be a nightmare scenario. Chinese media estimates that Boeing sold more than $50 billion worth of planes to China over the past 5 years. Chinese airlines are expected to purchase over 500 new aircraft over the next decade, and Boeing had been negotiating for most of those. Each aircraft delivery can yield between $100 million and $300 million in revenue, sometimes even up to $500 million with maintenance deals included. If China walks away from that plan, it leaves a gaping hole. Airbus and even Russia-China joint ventures like the CR929 may step in eventually, but they're not short-term fixes. Some observers suggest China is trying to teach Boeing a lesson, even if it means complicating things for itself. Meanwhile, Boeing insists the whole situation is politically motivated. Company lobbyists have told U.S. lawmakers, this trade war isn't just about the next 10 years. It could shut us out of the Chinese market for the next 30. While some in Congress push for tariff flexibility to protect Boeing, the Trump administration is digging in. This is our long-term strategy. No compromises. In many ways, Boeing is now paying the price of a political showdown. Last year, Boeing reported $7.4 billion in revenue from Chinese deliveries. This year, it expected $9 to $10 billion. But those projections could now be slashed to almost nothing. Experts warn that this situation won't stay confined to aviation. If China continues to target U.S. aerospace while Washington retaliates with more sanctions, it could trigger full-scale economic conflict across multiple industries. Chinese imports of U.S. chemicals, agriculture, and semiconductors could be next in line. If that happens, it would mark the second act in this trade war saga, bringing mutual export losses and raising the likelihood of a global recession. Boeing, then, is just the opening chapter. Similar moves could follow in any strategic sector. Analysts warn that a similar backlash in agriculture or tech would send shockwaves through U.S. employment and investor confidence. Europe's Airbus is watching closely. While Airbus says it won't take advantage of trade wars, the company also admits that if demand shifts their way, they'll step up. Their stock is already showing slight gains. Investors are betting China might pivot fully toward Airbus. If that deal becomes official, it could deal another crushing blow to Boeing. Ultimately, this aviation conflict is a warning sign for deeper economic shifts. From pricing and technology to market dependence, the landscape is changing fast. China's halt on Boeing deliveries represents not just lost contracts, but lost decades of trade relationships. With more than 1,000 jets in the pipeline for China, potentially worth $150 billion, and up to $200 billion when including service contracts, it's easy to see why this is one of the biggest commercial tremors of the current trade standoff. And unless the U.S. backs off soon, Boeing's stock could continue to nosedive. A $50 billion market cap loss might soon look like the best-case scenario. The ripple effects could touch thousands of supply chain companies, millions of workers, and families across both nations. Some argue it's just a negotiation tactic. Maybe China resumes partial deliveries later. But right now, neither Washington nor Beijing seems ready to compromise. That a previously protected industry like civil aviation has become the front line of a fierce trade battle speaks volumes. Protectionism and nationalism are gaining ground under the banners of security and strategy, and global corporations are caught in the middle. Boeing is now the face of U.S.-China tension, and it has a colossal market to lose. So how might this end? Some forecasts suggest that at some point, both nations will come to the table, at least to safeguard key sectors. But if that doesn't happen, Boeing's crisis may deepen, and broader retaliation may unfold. If China scales back imports of additional major U.S. goods, the trade war will escalate, and recession fears will intensify. With uncertainty mounting, investors are torn between holding out hope for a resolution or pulling out before another shock hits. That's why Boeing's shares remain highly volatile. Civil aviation has become a political chess piece. COMAC is quietly rising. And China's suspension of Boeing deliveries isn't just about halting a few hundred planes. It's about billions in contracts, advanced tech, and a geopolitical showdown. This battle puts $10 to $12 billion in annual Boeing revenue on the line, endangers $150 billion in long-term contracts, and could wipe out over $50 billion in stock value. For the U.S. economy, losing a buyer that makes up nearly 20% of its aerospace exports is a staggering loss. And it likely won't stop there. A new front in the trade war has been opened. And Boeing's case makes it crystal clear just how brutal this economic rivalry has become. Right now, both sides are holding firm. Beijing's message is, "We're playing our trump card because of tariffs." And the Trump administration replies, "China broke the deal, and we won't budge." Who knows? Maybe tomorrow brings a diplomatic breakthrough and Boeing gets an exception. But until both sides reach the point where continued losses are no longer tolerable, this standoff could drag on. Companies, workers, and supply chains are left in limbo. And a single firm, Boeing, stands to lose $150 billion in potential deals if things don't turn around. We're watching the most intense face-off the aviation industry has ever seen. And this story might just be getting started.